Hello and welcome to Psyched, the show where we explore psychedelics through social, economic, and political perspectives. Let's introduce our next speaker. We have Rahn. So JR is a former Silicon Valley tech executive who realized that transformational solutions to mental illness and addiction might lie in psychedelic medicines. He spent 2 years researching and began personally investing in psychedelic research through his investment company. JR partnered with drug development veteran Stephen Hurst to start Mindmed in 2019, assembling a leading clinical drug discovery and development team with vast experience conducting clinical trials and research on drug candidates derived from psychedelics. Before starting Mindmed, JR worked in market expansion and operations at Uber. After leaving Uber, he was backed by the Silicon Valley tech accelerator, Combinator, for his company Upgraded. Upgraded is partnered with Apple to provide device financing for Apple customers in Europe. JR, thank you for joining us and welcome to the show. Hey JR, how are you?
I'm here, I hope. Can you hear
me? You're good, man.
All
and you
right,
have
cool.
This cool suit on that I think has sort of a globe on it.
All right, I'll take it.
Okay. I think it's the green screen effect from Zoom, but it looks classy, man. So happy to have you on. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me, man.
Yeah, so I would really love to just start the conversation hearing a little bit about yourself. What inspired you to get into mental health and eventually transition into psychedelics?
Yeah, so, psychedelics to me were, in many ways, they were almost like a scary thing for when I was going through college, when it sort of entered my early career. It was something that I never really had experience with as a younger self. I always had this stigma against them. And then I went through some serious suffering in my life in terms of battling with addiction, having some anxiety issues, all while at sort of the precipice of life in Silicon Valley. I had worked at Uber, went through the Y Combinator program, which is where companies like Airbnb and Dropbox came out of, but was struggling, really. And a friend noticed that I was struggling and suggested that I consider psychedelics. At the same time, I had really seen this microdosing trend that was ongoing in Silicon Valley, and it still is ongoing. James Fadiman's book, these kind of things really prompted me to look at these substances in a new light. And when I was looking to start a new company, I was less enthralled with the notion of making taxis cheaper again, or iPhones a little bit less expensive on a monthly basis, which I had done in my prior life in Silicon Valley, and was really, struggling with addiction in this sort of high growth startup arena, and at the same time watching news flow around the opioid crisis basically on a weekly basis, and going, there's got to be a better solution out there. And so that was really how I joined the psychedelics community. I had always used these substances for my own personal treatment, but in terms of landing so that I can be on a webinar now, it really came out of not necessarily defining that psychedelics were going to be the next company I was going to start. It started with, how do we solve mental health and addiction issues that are extremely prevalent in America?
Definitely. And did you have some sort of, I guess, key insight that really brought you specifically to the to psychedelics as the solution to that mental health crisis?
Well, I had seen obviously a lot of the work that was going on coming out of Switzerland. I had took a few trips over to Switzerland, had many discussions with some of the leading researchers over there. And at the same time, was noticing that things like methadone and Suboxone weren't working. And a friend had mentioned Ibogaine to me as a potential solution, and that I could consider going down to Mexico for a treatment. And the issue that came up for me was my mother died of a heart attack when I was 8 years old, and my father a few years ago, also from a heart condition. And because of that, I wasn't able to go for Ibogaine treatment. And I was talking to a guy named Dr. Ken Alper at New York University, and really sort of digging in on how Ibogaine works, what's its mechanism of action. And he mentioned that I should go and speak with Stephen Hurst and Stan Glick, Stan being the inventor of 18MC, as a potential solution for the opioid crisis. And so that's how the founding of Mindmed came about.
Beautiful. So can you tell us a little bit about Mindmed, the types of problems that the organization is working on solving? Yeah.
Well, we started in addiction with our lead program, 18MC, which is a non-hallucinogenic derivative of Ibogaine. And it is now currently in phase 1 studies that are ongoing. And we aim to start a phase 2 study of 18MC by the end of this year. What we're really focused on there is the opioid crisis. There's, cost the country $500 billion a year, 11 million people are misusing opioids. This is a really big problem. And so we're most focused right now on opioid withdrawal, and we'll be moving into opioid longer-term addiction and actually dealing with the hardest part of addiction, which I can talk from personal experience about, is not necessarily getting off a substance, but it's staying off a substance when you have these cues that really trigger you to want something like cocaine or alcohol or opioids again. We've added a lot to our pipeline since we became the first psychedelic pharmaceutical company to list in March. We've now added a microdosing division that is doing a phase 2 trial of microdosing of LSD for adult ADHD. In addition, last week, we announced what I think will become one of our biggest programs, Project Lucy, which is targeting a phase 2B clinical trial, and we'll be applying to open an IND or investigational new drug at the FDA on this as a commercial drug trial for high-dose LSD in anxiety patients. And this is a really relevant topic, I think, in the midst of COVID-19, when we see benzos and other anxiety medications up 32% from the beginning of February to the beginning of March. We've talked a lot about the opioid crisis. What I think is very much on the horizon is the Xanax crisis. And we think that high-dose LSD might be a solution to mitigate anxiety. And we are working with Dr. Gasser, Peter Gasser in Switzerland, and Dr. Matthias Lichty at University Hospital Basel. They have a phase 2 ongoing study that we acquired the rights to and the data usage of once that reads out, which I think will be instrumental in our discussion as we seek to open an IND for anxiety in the United States with the FDA.
I'd love to rewind a little bit and actually dive deeper into microdosing. I think that there's a lot of individuals, a lot of students especially, who are prescribed ADHD medications, things like Adderall, modafinil, Ritalin. And I was just wondering your perspective on, can microdosing be a solution that helps us get students the help that they need, but also be able to help them over the long term develop the habits or the focus necessary to be able to actually stop using those medications? Or is this meant to be more of a solution that acts similarly to some of those more traditional ADHD medications and kind of having individuals using them over the course of years of time whenever they're in situations where they need it?
Sure. I think the anecdotal evidence definitely points in the direction that LSD is a great way to get off of a stimulant-based medicine, right? What we're initially looking for in this phase 2 trial is treating the traditional endpoints that you would find in any adult ADHD medicine that's coming to market. We will evaluate, on an interim basis, what those results start looking like and look for a signal. But I think it's premature for me to have a discussion on ultimately how we think that microdosing of LSD will come to the market. But we certainly see the need for an alternative to these stimulant-based medicines, which, I was put on from the age of 13. They are addictive. They have terrible side effects. And I think our entire generation, Generation Adderall, are looking for new ways to deal with, a very common but impactful mental illness.
Mm-hmm. The other thing I wanted to ask about was, there's been press around Mindmed and kind of stopping a bad trip, developing some sort of compound or mechanism to be able to stop a bad trip. Could you tell us a little bit more about that, the approach to developing something like that?
Look, I think let's start with the need. And then and then we'll get to the outcome. I think the need is, a lot of folks that are probably on this call right now have experiences with these substances, and they don't really have anxiety about considering taking, or undergoing an experiential treatment or treating themselves. But for the rest of the country and the rest of the world, the concept around a psychedelic assisted therapy is is quite a daunting, I think, thing to sell, to pitch my aunt on, to can have my uncle take me seriously. And I think the main reason for that is people are scared. There's stigma and they're scared. And so what we saw with our LSD neutralizer technology was an opportunity to basically say, look, there is the possibility that you're going to have a bad experience. And actually, that bad experience might be the most therapeutic part of an experiential therapy. However, I think if one knows that there's a way to stop it, to stop a trip midway through, while we don't necessarily think that therapists and doctors will necessarily use this very often, I think it can really suppress a lot of anxiety going into that experience for the first time. And so this really for us is more of a feature and not a standalone product. We hope to make it available on LSD as we seek approval as part of that. And I think will be something that's valued by the market one day.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. No, that's very interesting. I would love to hear about, what are the biggest antagonists to Mindmed and also just kind of to the psychedelic space being able to continue on and progress?
Look, I think, I've said this multiple times to our community, the biggest antagonist and threat to us is stigma and the lack of unity. To me, we know these substances can make a great impact on society. We need to prove it now to the FDA, and we need to prove it to the rest of society. And that, I think, is going to be part of the biggest battle. We're going to need the clinical data through the FDA to prove that something is actually a medicine. Mindmed takes the approach of we are seeking to treat patients for mental health. We're not involving ourselves in the other parts of the community. Those folks that feel passionate about those sides should continue to push that forward. But my mission and Mindmed's mission really is to focus on patients. And that is why I got into this. it's out of personal struggle. And I think there's a lot of other folks just like me that are struggling, and psychedelic inspired medicines can have a huge impact on solving problems for a lot of people.
Mm-hmm. There's a lot of concern from the community of kind of the balance of being able to, have things open, really take an open science type of approach, and then also being able to issue the patents necessary to keep a business alive to actually bring compounds to market. I'd love to hear your thoughts on, patents, intellectual property, and how they kind of interweave into this ecosystem.
So our desire is to never try to patent a compound that's been around for many, many years and previously had a patent around it for a composition of matter. However, if we're working on something innovative and we're investing our shareholders' money into that and the public's money into developing that as a medicine, we would seek patentability around it. That is just traditionally how one deals with a new medicine. We're not necessarily saying, look, we want to grow psilocybin and distribute it through a dispensary. That's not our model. Our model is to make medicines that have disruptive technologies and new ways and next generation ways of approaching some of these illnesses. I think 18MC is a great example of, ibogaine has been around for a number of years. 18MC was designed to have its specific characteristics so that it could potentially be a better medicine. And so I think one needs to look at, we now have this amazing opportunity. There are investors that are interested in coming into this space to progress it. It has taken a long time to get here, right? We need to consider if we can attract investment into all of the folks that are working in this space, both nonprofit and for-profit. Investors should have protection too to bring that to bring the space forward for the dollars that they are investing.
Mm-hmm. I'd love for you to kind of extend on that last point. Is how do you see Mindmed and just for-profits in general intersecting with the nonprofits of the past that have been doing great work over the last few decades and are continuing to push forward with their own efforts to be able to bring these compounds to the masses?
Well, look, these are really big problems, right? Not one single player is going to be able to solve every major mental health and addiction issue that pervades society. I think we need as many people working on these issues as possible. And we should do that in a unified way so that the patients that are in need get the medicines that they deserve. So we don't discriminate against nonprofit versus for-profit. Our approach is for-profit. I think we need to be very clear about that. But at the same time, we do believe that these medicines need to be accessible, and they need to be accessible to everyone in society. And so we'll be working with nonprofits in the future on how we make that possible. We've already funded compassionate use programs that are ongoing right now, treating people that we don't talk about a lot. But we are making efforts to make sure that folks that need these medicines get them.
Mm-hmm. If you could break down the demographics of how individuals actually receive psychedelic assisted care, let's say, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, do you feel like the majority of people will be going to significantly more, I guess, streamlined, professionalized medical clinics? Do you think more people will be having just recreational experiences that might be facilitated by the underground? Or in the last camp, kind of more of these retreat type centers in legal jurisdictions? How do you think that that'll play out in regards to demography over the next few years?
Look, I think people that have serious mental illnesses need the care of a doctor or a therapist. And I don't think that should ever be disrupted. That's one of the most important relationships that I've had when struggling with addiction and mental health issues. And I would hate to see a paradigm in which those folks get disrupted just because there's a new substance on the block. And I think a lot of times we talk about psychedelics, but we don't talk enough about the therapists You know, the folks that are involved in integration, that, you know, bring you through some of your darkest times. And my belief is that that is probably the hardest thing to scale. You know, convincing a therapist all around the world and in the United States that you know, these novel approaches and new paradigms have the ability to really impact patients in a very big manner. But it is probably the most important thing that we need to consider. And so we'll be looking at ways on how we do scale that. At the same time, you know, I really think there's a difference between a patient and somebody that is just looking at psilocybin as a recreational weekend. And like I said, we are most interested in the patients that we can help.
Yeah, definitely. One of the things that us at Tabula Rasa that we've been doing is, you know, taking and really looking at, you know, every faction of this market. And one of the things that we've been seeing is, even though we ourselves aren't looking to invest in the, you know, kind of underground gray area markets, we are seeing that there's tremendous activity bubbling up there. There's, you know, we see dozens, you know, dozens of new dispensaries per month that are coming out and offering dried mushroom type products. And so just significantly more individuals in the underground having access to these types of compounds. And, you know, as a result, probably, you know, many individuals who may have those, you know, severe, you know, types of issues that really need psychedelic therapy the most, being able to gain access through these unconventional routes to these medicines and to these compounds. I was wondering if you have any thoughts on, you know, how can the above ground for-profit space create an infrastructure or be able to help, I guess, the problems that come with an underground market that might be bringing harm to individuals, you know, us seeing either more psychotic breaks or cases of schizophrenia as a result of this. Is there anything that the for-profit above ground community can be doing to help those individuals either make a decision to more responsibly interact with these compounds, or being able to, after they've already consumed those things, direct them in a path that can continue helping them in a better way?
Look, I think you know, harm reduction is definitely something that needs to be prioritized around the world, right? And we don't want to see people hurting themselves with these substances. At the same time, as a company that goes through the FDA pathway and deals with federal agencies, we need to prove the data first. And so the best thing that we can do right now is to actually prove that these are safe and effective drugs for a myriad of mental health issues. And so that's where we have a competitive advantage on our team's ability to present that data in the right way. And so I think that's where our time is going to be best spent. I'm going to leave the other components of, you know, whether folks want to use these substances recreationally and how they want to use them in their own homes. That's up to them. And you know, we're just never going to do something as a company that would risk our reputation with the FDA.
Mm-hmm,
I think the patients that we're seeking to treat, that would be a disservice to them, because we would be discredited as a company, and so would other organizations that are trying to get FDA approvals. They would also be discredited. So I'm just going to focus on what we know and the process that and action plan that we've outlined for ourselves.
Definitely. What are some of the, you know, biggest, you know, events to watch for over the next 5 years? What do you think are going to be the biggest, you know, breakthroughs in this space? Everything from kind of policy and research and culture. What are the things that we should be watching for?
Well, I think FDA approvals are a big component of this space, right? But then we also need to start thinking about how are these medicines going to be scaled, at least the experiential therapies. It's really the first time that you know, something like this has been done. You know, ketamine and esketamine traditionally don't have a psychotherapy component in a lot of the clinics that are sprouting up. And so I think what we're going to need to look for is, over the next 5 years, is a new paradigm in mental health. It's exciting, right? I mean, this gets you up in the morning. And so I think things to look out for besides just FDA approvals are our ability to succeed in scaling the medicines to people that need them. And that's not a small task. And it's going to need a lot of people driving home on that mission.
Definitely. I'd love to hear more about the collaboration with University Hospital Basel and how you're hoping to, just utilize this to increase access.
Look, Dr. Liechty has been working on LSD for 10 plus years. He's also worked on MDMA for much longer than that. He was one of the original scientists to discover the mechanism of action on MDMA at his time at University of Zurich. So he's a very interesting guy. I've learned a lot from him over the last year. And we're going to continue leveraging that knowledge, that experience, and coming up with some new things that aren't really in the public domain right now. There's a lot going on at the Liechty Lab. It's definitely become one of the leading research centers in psychedelics. And so I would look for a lot of great news flow that will come out of some of the inventions that are happening there, the new trials that we'll be engaging with. We just announced this morning that we began dosing and began treating patients with LSD for a phase 2 trial of cluster headaches, which is a terrible disease that really is described as one of the most painful experiences known to mankind. And there is a community of folks that have been using LSD to treat themselves, but have lacked the credibility of clinical data to really make this into a medicine for the rest of their community. And so we're hoping by funding and collaborating on that trial, we can help bring this to completion, because it's a terrible illness.
Mm-hmm. Is there in terms of your work and what you're passionate about, it's overall this field of mental health, right? And so if you weren't allowed to, for instance, for some reason, work in the psychedelic space on psychedelics, where would you be working? What would you be contributing to help advance mental health along?
Well, look, I think it's looking at the interconnectedness of mental health. Right now, we sort of treat them in these very narrow-minded views, like, oh, you're depressed. It's like, yeah, I'm depressed, but I have anxiety. I do too much coke, and I don't have any hair. But the reality is, we need to look at, I think, this continuum of mental health. And so if I wasn't working in psychedelics, it's just, psychedelics happen to, I think, be that connecting force that's needed in mental health. Mm-hmm. But if I wasn't working on a psychedelic drug company, I would probably be looking at more digital solutions and technologies that could be applied to mental health, which aren't that far out of the realm of where we might end up as a psychedelic pharmaceutical company. I think that technology is going to play a huge role in how we integrate into some of these therapies. But yeah, that's probably where I'd be. Like, I think this is one of the largest industries in the world where you don't have enough investment. Mm-hmm. And has been ignored, right? My co-founder, Stephen Hurst, when he was working on 18MC for years, he knocked on doors at venture capitalists on Sand Hill Road, and they said, oh, we don't want to have addicts as customers, we're not interested. There's still a stigma on a lot of the stuff we're working on. Even myself, like, talking about my own addiction issues publicly, at the start was like a little bit nerve-wracking. It's like, well, wait a minute, do I want to be lumped in? And then I thought about it and was like, actually, no, I need to take a leadership role here, and to really describe to people that these are interconnected issues, but we can have interconnected solutions. And so I'm really, really hoping that the excitement right now that is behind this space can lead to some changes for a lot of folks that are dealing with these multiple issues of mental health and addiction.
Definitely. Yeah. And, you've had a lot of success being able to make a name for Mindmed and build this incredible company up from scratch. I'm wondering, who do you see as the next generation? Who are some of the entrepreneurs, some of the companies in this space that you think are up and coming that folks should really be paying attention to in the field of psychedelics?
Look, I think there's a lot of very interesting companies out there, and I'm not going to name names, but okay. I think they're probably coming from places that you might not think. And we've seen some really interesting things. They don't have a fancy pitch deck. They don't have millions of dollars in their bank, but they're passionate and they have a good concept that needs development. And so as a company, we look for individuals and groups of individuals that have that passion, and we want to set up, fund that, and eventually bring it into our pipeline. And that doesn't necessarily mean it's a drug, right? There's a lot of technologies out there that we find interesting. There's just a lot going on, and I will leave it there, but stay tuned.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, JR, for joining us. We really appreciate your time, and we'll be happy to continue this conversation offline and afterwards.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me today.
Yeah, be well.